Lady Wren's Old Bookshop Mystery, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Shop That Smelled of Someone Else's Reading. The first thing anyone noticed about Wren and Parchment, if they had the patience to push open the door, which was stuck in damp weather and required a particular sideways pressure just below the handle, was not the books themselves but the smell of them. Not the smell one expects, of pleasant mustiness and old paper, but something far more particular, the smell of books that had been read in, lived beside, carried on long journeys and brought home again. It was the smell of other people's afternoons, if one can put it that way, and Miss Jane Marple, who had very little talent for romanticising but a considerable one for precision, identified it the moment she stepped across the threshold on a Tuesday in October. She had come on the recommendation of her niece, who had spoken of the shop in Stonebridge-on-Avon as perfectly enchanting, which Miss Marple privately translated as somewhat chaotic. She was not wrong. The shelves did not run in straight lines. They had been added to over decades in the manner of a garden where different owners had planted without consulting each other, so that a row of naval histories might end abruptly at a pillar and resume at a different height on the other side, leaving a gap occupied by a single chair with a cushion in a faded William Morris pattern, a side table bearing a cold cup of tea, and a small brass lamp that was switched on despite the tolerable natural light from the front window. Miss Marple found this chair, or rather, found herself gravitating towards it, as small, comfortable objects in public spaces tend to draw the elderly, and settled into it with the pleasant sensation of having arrived somewhere that had not expected her and did not mind. The shop was owned, she had been told, by a woman named Constance Wren, 71 years old, the granddaughter of the founder, who was said to know the exact location of every book in a collection that had long since exceeded any system of organisation. Miss Wren herself was not visible. A young woman with ink-stained fingers and the slightly over-focused expression of someone working hard not to appear to be listening, stood behind the small desk near the door, cataloguing something in a large ledger with a fountain pen. Her name, according to the small handwritten card beside the ledger, was Polly Ashford, and she had the look of a person who had recently been crying and was managing it splendidly. Beside the William Morris chair, arranged on the low shelf directly to Miss Marple's right, was a row of annotated books, not annotated by the shop, annotated by a previous owner, their notes in the margins in a consistent hand, a blue-black ink, a writer who apparently disagreed strongly with authors and was not shy about saying so. Miss Marple pulled one down and found 3 separate marginal protests in the first chapter alone. She found herself liking this unknown reader very much. "That was hers," said Polly Ashford, without looking up from her ledger. Miss Marple set the book down with the care one uses for other people's property. "Miss Wren's, you mean?" Polly glanced up for just a moment. She annotated everything she read. She said if a book didn't make you want to argue with it, it wasn't doing its job. She looked back down. There are 12 of them in that row. She'd been planning to sell them. She hadn't got round to it yet. The past tense was careful. It was the kind of careful that people apply to recent losses when they are not ready to speak of them plainly. "I'm very sorry," said Miss Marple. "When did she pass?" "Last Thursday," said Polly, and then pressed her lips together in the particular way of someone who has said slightly more than they intended. The shop held the particular silence of places that have recently lost a central presence. Not empty, exactly, but rearranging itself around an absence. Miss Marple sat with the annotated book in her lap and looked at the shelves with the patience of someone who has learned that most important things reveal themselves to those who sit still long enough. What she noticed, in the way that other people notice loose buttons or slightly wrong smells, was this. There was a book missing from the row. Not from the annotated 12. She counted those, and they were complete. But on the shelf above, where a set of volumes in matching green cloth bindings sat in sequence, there was a gap. The gap was not dusty. The absence was recent. And the books on either side of the gap leaned inward toward each other, as objects do when a neighbour has been removed in a hurry. She thought of Mrs. Partridge in St. Mary Mead, who had kept a set of matching diaries on her shelf for 30 years, and how the 1 year she had torn pages from one had been impossible to see from the outside. But Miss Marple had noticed because the spine of that particular volume sat fractionally higher than the rest, as though it had been replaced by someone in haste. The thing that had been in those torn-out pages had eventually come to light, as these things tend to. She said nothing about the gap. She replaced the annotated book carefully in its row and looked up at Polly Ashford with a warm, vague expression that invited conversation without demanding it. "I expect," Miss Marple said, "that it is very difficult to keep a shop going when one is also grieving. You must be extraordinarily capable, my dear." Polly Ashford's fountain pen hesitated over the ledger. "I'm managing," she said. And then, almost against her will, "It wasn't expected." That's what makes it harder somehow. She was perfectly well on Wednesday. "Perfectly well on Wednesday," Miss Marple repeated gently, "and gone by Thursday. That is a great shock for everyone who knew her, I imagine." "For everyone in the shop, certainly," said Polly. She hesitated. "And for her family, of course, such as they are." The last three words were not bitter exactly. They were something more measured. The assessment of someone who has watched a family closely and formed a view they consider accurate. Miss Marple turned to look at the annotated books again, though she was not really looking at them. She was thinking about the gap on the shelf above. She was thinking about the missing volume. She was thinking about what a woman who wrote in the margins of everything she read might have written that someone, recently, had felt it necessary to remove. She stayed another hour. She bought 3 books she did not need. She listened to the shop, which had things to tell if one knew how to hear. Chapter 2. The Family That Came Afterwards. The Wren family gathered on Thursday evening in the upstairs room above the shop. What Constance had called, according to Polly, the reading room, though it also served as a store for overflow stock, and the two functions had gradually merged until there were books on every available surface, including the floor beside the armchair, where Constance had apparently spent her evenings. Miss Marple learned this not from any introduction, but from the simple act of remaining in the shop after the sign was turned to closed, a circumstance she engineered by asking to use the lavatory at the precise moment that the family began to arrive and simply not returning to the street once she had. There were 4 of them. The nephew, Gerald Wren, 52, arrived first. He was the kind of man who entered rooms as though expecting to find something wrong with them. Not unpleasant exactly, but with an evaluative eye that swept surfaces before he'd finished saying hello. He was dressed in the particular way of people who have money but consider it vulgar to appear to care about it, which is to say very expensively but with small deliberate imperfections, a loosened tie, a scuff on one shoe that was too consistent to be accidental. He kissed Polly on the cheek and asked, before he asked anything else, whether the solicitor had been in touch. The niece, Marian Holt, née Wren, the other branch, was smaller and quieter and had the look of someone who had been pretty at 20 and had allowed it to drift out of her face without mourning it. She carried a canvas shopping bag that she set down with more care than its apparent weight required, and she moved through the shop in the practised way of someone who had been here often enough to know where the low shelf near the window would catch your hip. The third was a young man introduced as David Wren, Gerald's son, 26, who had brought a laptop and immediately opened it, which Miss Marple found interesting not because it was rude, though it was slightly, but because of the speed with which he did it, as though establishing that he had other things to attend to was a matter of some importance to him. The fourth was not family at all, though he arrived with them. His name was Mr. Sedley, and he was the family solicitor, a dry, careful man in his 60s, with the hands of someone who spent his days with paper, and the expression of someone who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. He sat in the chair nearest the door. Miss Marple, who had a particular faculty for being overlooked, stationed herself near the shelves in a way that suggested she was browsing. "Polly," said Gerald in the tone of someone continuing a conversation that the other party had not known had started, "you said there was something you wanted to show us." Polly set her fountain pen down. "I said there was something I thought you should know about." "Which is what exactly?" Polly had the look, Miss Marple thought, of someone who had rehearsed this several times and was now discovering that rehearsal did not help as much as one hoped. "Your aunt came to me last Wednesday morning, the morning before she died, and asked me to witness something, a document. I didn't read it. She asked me not to, and I didn't. But she folded it and put it in the green ledger, the old one, not the new one I use, and said that if anything ever happened to her, I was to give the green ledger to Mr. Sedley directly and to no one else." Mr. Sedley's expression did not change. He had the professional composure of a man whose face had learned not to be informative. Gerald's had no such training. "And have you given it to him?" "I gave it to him this morning," said Polly, before you arrived." The room contained, for a moment, the particular quality of silence that follows information landing in different ways for different people. Marian set her canvas bag on a chair and did not move her hands from its handles. David's laptop screen reflected in his glasses, but his fingers had stopped. "Right," said Gerald. "And what did it say?" Mr. Sedley allowed himself a small pause that was perfectly within professional bounds. "I am not yet in a position to share the contents in full," he said. "There are formalities. I will say that Miss Wren's wishes were clearly documented and the document was in proper form." "The shop," said Marian very quietly. "It's about what happens to the shop. This was not a question." Miss Marple noted that. It was also not said with the urgency of someone who needed to know the answer. It was said with the quietness of someone who believed they already did. Polly was looking at the shelf behind Miss Marple, not at Miss Marple. She had not yet registered Miss Marple as anything other than a late browser. At the shelf, specifically at the upper row where the green cloth volumes stood with their gap. Miss Marple turned, very naturally, and took down one of the adjacent volumes, opening it at random. Inside the front cover, in the same blue-black hand she had seen in the annotated books downstairs, was a date and a short note. Purchased at Gloucester Auction, 1987, Volume 4 of an incomplete set. The missing volumes matter more than this one. She placed it back carefully. She had once known a woman in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Fellows, who kept the post office and knew everyone's business rather better than was entirely comfortable, who had said that the most important thing in any collection of secrets was not what was kept, but what had been recently removed. Miss Marple had thought of it as small-town observation at the time. It seemed to her now that it was a much wider truth. Chapter 3. What Polly Did Not Say at Breakfast. Miss Marple had taken a room at the Bell Inn, which was 3 streets from Wren and Parchment, and had the advantage of a landlady who made proper tea and did not ask questions that required explanations. She had come to Stonebridge-on-Avon for no reason that she could have easily defended. Her niece had mentioned the town, and something in that mention had snagged, in the way that inconsequential things sometimes do when one is paying attention. She'd now been here 4 days, and she had become something of a fixture at the shop, which required no particular social engineering on her part because she had discovered that Polly Ashford found her presence settling rather than intrusive. Polly Ashford was 28, and had worked for Constance Wren for 6 years. She had come from London originally, from a position at a large auction house, and had taken the job at Wren and Parchment, as she once told Miss Marple over the shop's electric kettle, because I was tired of cataloguing things to be sold to people who wouldn't read them. She said this without self-consciousness and without seeking agreement. Miss Marple had found herself liking her very much. On Friday morning, Polly arrived at the shop 40 minutes before her usual time and went directly upstairs. Miss Marple knew this because she had taken to walking past the shop on her morning circuit and had observed the lights in the upper room going on at 7:15, which was unusual. She finished her circuit, had her breakfast, and arrived at the shop at 9, by which time Polly was behind the desk and the lights upstairs were off again. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "Were you upstairs earlier? I thought I saw the light." Polly did not quite pause before answering. "I wanted to check something in the stock records before we opened." The answer was smooth. It had the smoothness of a truth that has been decided upon in advance, which is not quite the same as a lie, but requires the same preparation. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and settled in the William Morris chair. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "More or less," said Polly. She turned to her ledger, then she turned back. It was the turn of someone remembering something they had decided to say. "Miss Marple, do you know anything about book provenance? The way you handle the older volumes, I thought perhaps—" "A little," said Miss Marple. "In the way that a person who has spent many years around libraries and borrowings tends to pick things up. Why do you ask?" Polly folded her hands on the ledger. Miss Wren had a collection, not the shop stock, her personal collection. Things she'd acquired over 40 years that she kept upstairs. Some of it is quite valuable, apparently. Mr. Sedley mentioned it when he came yesterday. He said the estate would need to be catalogued properly and that a specialist would be brought in. She paused. "I catalogued everything upstairs last spring. I know exactly what was up there." "And," said Miss Marple, with the patience of someone who has learned that the most important word in any conversation is often the first one. "One of the items I catalogued in March is not there now," said Polly. "A bound journal, handwritten, not printed. from the 1880s. Wren family history partly, but also records of early book purchases. Miss Wren told me it was the founding document of the shop, essentially. She said it was worth more to the family than any monetary value, and it is missing. It was there on Wednesday morning. I checked before Miss Wren went to her sister's. I checked because she'd asked me to water the plant upstairs, and I always confirm the collection is in order when I go up. Polly met Miss Marple's eyes, and it was not there this morning. Miss Marple looked at the shelf behind Polly's desk. On it, 3 family photographs in mismatched frames, Constance Wren at different ages, recognisable from the eyes, which were very direct and slightly humorous. In the middle photograph, she stood with a younger woman whose posture Miss Marple associated with people who have just won an argument and are being gracious about it. "Is that Marian Holt?" she asked. Polly turned. "Yes, taken about 15 years ago. They were close once." Once. The word sat in the air with more weight than its single syllable suggested. "Miss Marple," said Polly carefully, "do you think I should tell the police?" Miss Marple considered. She thought of the gap on the shelf. She thought of the canvas bag that Marian had carried with more care than its apparent weight required. She thought of Constance Wren's annotated margins, the books arranged in the order of a mind that thought in parallels. "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it might be worth establishing first exactly what the journal contained. Would you happen to know?" Polly was quiet for a long moment. "I have a list," she said. "I photographed each page. Miss Wren asked me to, as part of the cataloguing. She wanted a record in case anything ever happened to the original." "How very sensible of her," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Polly, and for the first time since Miss Marple had entered the shop she smiled. She usually was. Chapter 4. The Contents of a Careful Mind. The photographs of the journal pages were on Polly's telephone, which she passed across the desk to Miss Marple, with a wordless confidence that Miss Marple found touching, given that they had known each other less than a week. Miss Marple looked through them steadily, one after another, with her reading glasses on her nose and the electric kettle making its preliminary whistle on the counter behind her. The journal was written in a hand that slanted left, unusual and consistent with left-handedness in someone who had been made to use their right hand for formal writing, a common enough situation in the 1880s that produced this specific signature in the script. The entries were dated but not titled. They ran from 1879 to 1903. The early pages were dominated by accounts of book purchases, markets, auctions, private collections, with notes on condition, provenance, and price. The later pages shifted. The writer's tone changed. Less commercial, more personal. These were the pages Miss Marple read with the greater attention. In 1891, there was an entry about a dispute. The founding Wren, one Arthur Wren, bookshop keeper, had purchased a collection from a house sale in Bath. Among the collection was a set of illuminated manuscripts that he had listed and priced but never put on public sale. The reason, recorded in a careful paragraph, was that the manuscripts had been found, upon closer examination, to bear the bookplate of a private library that had been dissolved under circumstances he described as not entirely regular. Arthur Wren had written that he had made inquiries and had been satisfied that the seller had rightful ownership, but the entry was followed, 3 pages later, by a second entry on the same matter, noting that the seller had died before the inquiry could be fully completed, and that Arthur had decided to hold the manuscripts privately until the question resolves itself to my satisfaction. It had not resolved itself. The manuscripts appeared in the stock list sporadically, never priced for sale until the 1920s, when they simply stopped appearing. Miss Marple scrolled further. In 1898, an entry noted the birth of a child, Arthur's first grandchild, and the beginning of the next generation of the Wren family. The entry was warm and brief, but in the margin of this entry, added in different ink, older ink, more faded, the blue-black ink of Constance Wren, was a single annotation, C 1891. This is why. Miss Marple took off her reading glasses and polished them, which she did when she was thinking. "The manuscripts," she said. "Are they still in the collection upstairs?" Polly looked up from the kettle. "They were listed in my catalogue, yes. 5 volumes, medieval. I photographed those pages as well, they're in the locked cabinet." "And the cabinet is still locked?" "I checked this morning. Yes, the manuscripts are there." Miss Marple replaced her glasses. So whoever took the journal was not primarily interested in the manuscripts themselves. They were interested in what the journal said about the manuscripts. Or about something else, said Polly. There are entries I haven't fully read. The last 30 pages are about the second generation, Constance's father and his sister. The family division. Family division, Miss Marple repeated. Polly poured the tea, which she had a habit of doing with slightly more focus than the task required, a small act of precision in the midst of uncertain things. Constance never spoke about it directly, but I understood from things she said, indirectly over the years, that her father and his sister had a falling out over the shop. The sister, Edna, married a man named Holt and moved to Bristol, Marian's mother. She always believed she'd been cheated out of her share of the business. And Marian Holt shares that belief. I think, said Polly carefully, that Marian has spent her whole life in the middle of it, not quite believing it and not quite able to stop believing it, which is its own kind of difficult. Miss Marple thought of a family she had known in St Mary Mead, the Blakely brothers, who had divided their father's property 40 years ago and never spoken of it properly, so that their children grew up inheriting the grievance alongside the furniture, which is a worse kind of inheritance because you cannot sell it. She had watched it play out over 2 generations, and it had not made her optimistic about the resolvability of old property disputes within families. What would the journal say, she asked? That someone would prefer the solicitor not to read? Polly held her cup without drinking from it. Constance put a document in the green ledger on Wednesday morning. She asked me to take it to Mr. Sedley. I did. I don't know what it said, she paused, but I think she knew she was in danger. I think that document was something she'd been putting off writing for a long time, and she decided, on Wednesday, that she couldn't put it off any longer. Why? Said Miss Marple. What happened on Wednesday? Gerald came, said Polly. Early in the morning, before the shop opened, they were upstairs together for nearly an hour. I didn't hear what was said, but when he left, Constance came down and made the tea herself. She never made the tea herself, and she looked at the shelf for a long time without taking anything down. And then she said, Polly, I think I've been rather foolish about trusting people who needed something from me. And I didn't know what to say to that, so I just agreed with her. And then on Thursday... She stopped. On Thursday she was dead, said Miss Marple gently. She'd had a heart problem for years, said Polly. Her doctor wasn't surprised. It was perfectly natural, apparently. She looked directly at Miss Marple. Apparently. Chapter 5. What Doctors Say and What They See. The doctor's name was Farwell, Colin Farwell, 60, who had been Constance Wren's physician for 17 years and whose surgery was on the far side of the market square. Miss Marple called on him not as an investigator, which she was not, officially or otherwise, but as a newly registered patient, her own doctor in Saint. Thus Mary Mead was perfectly adequate, but she had developed, she told the receptionist, a tiresome problem with her left knee, and found it more convenient to see someone locally while she was staying in town. Dr. Farwell had the slightly weary manner of a good doctor who had been practicing long enough to have heard most things and learned to respond to all of them with the same measured register. He examined her knee, which did have a genuine and long-standing stiffness, prescribed nothing she didn't already know about, and then sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had identified a conversational gender and was deciding how to manage it. "You're staying at the Bell Inn," he said. "Mrs. Paget mentioned it. She said you'd been in the bookshop quite a bit." "I am very fond of bookshops," said Miss Marple, with complete honesty. "It is an exceptionally good one. Such a sad loss, Miss Wren." "Mrs. Wren," he said. "She was married briefly, years ago. She reverted to Wren professionally, but it was Mrs. formally." "I do beg your pardon. A sad loss all the same. She seemed to have been a remarkable woman." Dr. Farwell looked at his desk. His hands were folded in the way of someone who has decided something and is arranging their thoughts around it. "She was," he said, "and in good health, relatively speaking, for her age and her history. The heart condition was managed. She took her medication reliably. She was careful." "Careful," Miss Marple said. "That is a precise word." "It is the right word for her." He paused. "I signed the death certificate. There was nothing irregular about the presentation. Heart failure in a woman of 71 with an existing cardiac condition. It requires no particular explanation." He said this with the flatness of a statement he had repeated more than once, possibly to himself. "I am a careful doctor, Miss Marple. I have been one for 40 years. I do not make careless determinations." "Of course not," said Miss Marple. and yet you find yourself somewhat uneasy." He looked at her. It was a direct look, the look of a man assessing whether he has misjudged a situation. "There was a residue," he said, "on her lips and at the corner of her mouth. Very slight. I noted it, and attributed it to the circumstances of the death. These things are not uncommon. I would not ordinarily mention it." He stopped. "But," said Miss Marple, "but she had been drinking tea when she died. There was a cup on the table, and someone had washed it up." He said this carefully, as though choosing whether to include it at each step. "The cup was in the drying rack. Her cleaner doesn't come until Monday. Constance lived alone and was not, in my experience, in the habit of washing up immediately after making tea." Miss Marple thought of the residue. She thought of plant-derived compounds. There are several that mimic the appearance of heart failure, working slowly through an afternoon's cup of tea, producing no signs that distinguish themselves easily from a condition the patient already had. She had read about such things in the course of a long life and a particular kind of attentiveness. She did not mention any of this to Dr. Farwell. "Did anyone else know about her heart condition?" she asked. "The precise nature of it? The medication she took?" "Her family, I imagine. These things are discussed." He unfolded his hands and folded them again. "Her nephew Gerald asked me about it. About a month ago. He came in, not as a patient. He doesn't see me, but he said he was concerned about his aunt's health and wanted to understand what her long-term prognosis might be." "A caring nephew," said Miss Marple. "He was very specific in his questions," said Dr. Farwell, "about the medication, the dosage, the interaction effects. He said the last two words in a way that suggested he had been thinking about them for several days. "Thank you for your time," said Miss Marple. "You've been very helpful about my knee." He looked at her with a particular expression. "Miss Marple," he said, "I would not want to be a man who had noted something and done nothing about it." "No," said Miss Marple, "one wouldn't. Good afternoon, Dr. Farwell." Chapter 6. The Nephew, Who Asked Good Questions. Gerald Wren had an office in the new development at the edge of town, one of those glass-faced buildings that seem to have been designed for a different climate and sit in English rain with the particular self-consciousness of things that aspire to look international. He ran a property investment firm, which Miss Marple understood to mean that he purchased things and waited for them to become worth more, and had done well enough at it to have the office, the expensive clothes, and the car parked in the reserved bay outside that was large enough to be aspirational. She called on him on the pretext of inquiring about properties for rent. She told his assistant, a niece, who was considering relocating to the area, and had heard that Mr. Wren's firm handled residential lettings as well as commercial. This was entirely plausible. Gerald Wren received her himself, in the way of businessmen who prefer to know things at first hand, and trust their ability to manage any situation face to face. He was, she observed, a man of managed charm. It came naturally enough not to be entirely false, but it was directed, purposeful. He offered her tea, remembered her name with a promptness that suggested he had looked at his diary before the meeting, and spoke about the property market with the fluency of a man who knew his subject and enjoyed knowing it. "You're staying at the Bell," he said. "Are you finding Stonebridge to your liking?" "Very much," said Miss Marple. "I confess I have spent more time in your aunt's bookshop than looking at properties. It is a wonderful collection. What a loss!" Gerald's expression performed sympathy with reasonable skill. "It was a shock," he said. "She was getting on, of course, but these things are never— one doesn't expect it." He settled back in his chair. "The shop will be sorted out properly. Mr. Sedley is handling everything." "She built it into something remarkable," Miss Marple said. "You must have wonderful childhood memories of it." "My father wasn't involved in the shop side," he said. "That was always Aunt Constance's domain. I grew up visiting, but not. We weren't bookish, our branch. My father was a practical man." The way he said practical was interesting. It was said in distinction to something, to Constance, to books, to the idea of spending one's life doing something for reasons that weren't commercial. It was not contemptuous. It was comparative, in the way of people who have decided that the comparison resolves in their favour. "And the estate," said Miss Marple, with the artlessness of someone thinking aloud, "will be quite considerable, I imagine. An Edwardian building in the town centre, a private collection of some real value. It must be a comfort to know it will be in good hands." "My hands, presumably," said Gerald, and then caught himself slightly. "Or, well, Mr. Sedley will advise. There may be various elements to it." His eye moved briefly to the window and back. My aunt was... She had very fixed ideas about the shop continuing. Whether that's practical, given the market, fixed ideas that she perhaps put in writing, said Miss Marple, with the gentle, vague helpfulness of someone who is simply agreeing. Gerald's hands were resting on the desk. They did not move. I imagine so, he said. She was always organised in that way. The journal, for instance, said Miss Marple, watching a pair of pigeons on the window ledge without appearing to watch Gerald. I understand she had kept a remarkable family archive. The young woman at the shop mentioned it. Polly, he said. The name was flat in his mouth. She's efficient enough, I suppose, though I'm not sure the shop needs a full-time... The journal went back to the founding of the shop, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. Rather valuable as a historical document, I should think. All sorts of interesting things about the early collection, the acquisitions, the provenance of various items, that sort of thing which can seem quite dry, but becomes very relevant when questions of ownership arise. Gerald was still, the kind of still that is a controlled version of not still. I imagine it's all packed up with the estate now, he said, to be catalogued properly. I imagine so, said Miss Marple. Now, about this property for my niece. She's looking for somewhere with good natural light, and she does like to be near a bookshop. She left the office 20 minutes later, having learnt 3 things that she had not technically been told. Gerald had visited his aunt the Wednesday before her death. He had a specific and recent interest in the contents of the family journal. And when she had mentioned provenance of acquisitions in connection with ownership questions, his fingers had tightened on the desk in a way that suggested the word provenance was not abstract to him at all. Chapter 7. What Marian Holt Carried. Marian Holt lived in a terraced house on the hill behind the church, one of a row built in the 1930s, narrow and well kept, with the particular neatness of a person who lives alone and has made a compact with their own domestic standards. The front window had books in it, which Miss Marple noted with interest, because they were arranged not decoratively but functionally, in the way of someone who uses the windowsill as overflow shelving. Miss Marple called on Marian on a Saturday afternoon, bringing a jar of homemade marmalade from the Bellins' breakfast table, and the explanation that she had heard from Polly Ashford that Marian had been a particular friend of Miss Wren's in earlier years, and that she hoped Marian would forgive the intrusion, but she had wanted to express her condolences in person. Marian received her without warmth and without hostility, the balanced neutrality of someone who has learned not to commit to a register before they understand the situation. The sitting room held the canvas bag Marian had carried to the shop on Thursday evening. It sat by the armchair with what Miss Marple would have called a conscious placement, the placement of something that had been moved more than once before arriving at a spot that suggested it had always been there. Marian made tea with the efficiency of someone who does it automatically, thinking about other things. She sat across from Miss Marple with both hands around her cup, and spoke about Constance in the way of someone who has rehearsed their feelings into a manageable form. She was remarkable, she was difficult, she was absolutely herself, she will not be replaced. You were close, said Miss Marple. We were, said Marian. Then we weren't. Then, we were trying to be again these last few years. She looked at her hands. She reached out to me in the spring, said she wanted to talk about the family properly at last. We'd been... There's an old grievance, as there is in most families if you go back far enough. About the shop, Marian glanced up. Polly talks. She mentioned that there had been a difficulty between the branches of the family. She didn't go into detail. My grandmother felt she'd been pushed out, said Marian, by Constance's father. She wasn't wrong, I think, but she'd also have made a poor job of running the shop. She wasn't a reader, she hadn't the temperament for it. What she wanted wasn't the shop itself, but acknowledgement. That she'd been owed something and hadn't been given it. I think Constance knew that. I think that's why she reached out. Marian looked at the window. She wanted to make it right. Somehow. In the will, or... She wouldn't tell me the details. She just said she'd found something in the journal that confirmed her grandmother's version of events, and she wanted to act on it. The 1891 entries, said Miss Marple. Marian looked at her steadily. What do you know about 1891? I read one of the photographs Polly took, said Miss Marple. I may be putting things together incorrectly, but it seemed to me that Arthur Wren had acquired something in 1891 that should perhaps have been shared more fairly, and that the family knew this, and that the journal documented it rather precisely. Marian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Constance told me there was documentation in the journal that showed the division of assets between her father and my grandmother had not been what it appeared, that my grandmother had been persuaded to accept considerably less than her share in exchange for signing documents she hadn't fully understood. She pressed her lips together. The manuscripts, among other things. Constance said the journal showed the manuscripts should by rights have been divided between the two branches, and that her father had retained sole possession through, she used the word, misdirection. "And this is what was in the document she gave to Mr. Sedley," said Miss Marple. "I think so. I hope so." Marian set her cup down. "I didn't take the journal, Miss Marple. I want to be clear about that. I went upstairs on Thursday evening to look for it, because Constance had mentioned it, and because I thought, with the family all there, I thought I should see if it was safe before someone else had the same idea. It wasn't there. The gap was already there when I arrived." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And the canvas bag you carried that evening? Forgive me for noticing, but you carried it with unusual care." Marian looked at the bag by the armchair. A long moment passed. Then she reached into the bag and lifted out a book, a slim, cloth-bound volume with a green spine. Not the journal, one of the annotated shop books. She held it out to Miss Marple. "She gave it to me on Wednesday," Marian said, "when I came to see her. She said she wanted me to have it, that it was a record of a kind that I would understand when I read the margins." Miss Marple took it and opened it. Inside the cover, in blue-black ink, "For Marian. The truth is in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. I am sorry it took so long. With love, Constance." Chapter 8. 3 Things That Happened on Wednesday. By Monday morning, Miss Marple had assembled 3 facts about the Wednesday before Constance Wren's death, and she was sitting in the William Morris chair, arranging them in her mind as one arranges furniture that has arrived in the wrong order. The first, Gerald had come to the shop early in the morning and spent an hour with Constance upstairs. What had been said was unknown, but the effect on Constance had been measurable. She had come down shaken, made the tea herself, and spoken to Polly about foolish trust. The second, Constance had then written the document she placed in the green ledger and asked Polly to take it to Mr. Sedley in the event of anything happening. She had reached out to Marian, or Marian had come to her, the sequence was not entirely clear, and given her the annotated book. She had done both of these things in a single day, which suggested a woman who had made a decision and was acting on it with some urgency. The third, someone had removed the family journal from the upstairs collection before Marian arrived on Thursday evening. Marian had not taken it. Gerald was the obvious person, which made Miss Marple consider him carefully and provisionally, but the absence of the journal was more suggestive than an accusation. Whoever had taken it had known precisely which volume to remove, and had done so quickly, which meant either they had been to the collection before or Constance had described the journal with enough precision for its location to be obvious. Polly arrived and found Miss Marple in the chair. She stopped, looked at her for a moment, and set her bag down with the expression of someone who has decided something. "Miss Marple," she said, "I need to tell you something I should have said earlier." "Please do," said Miss Marple. "The green ledger, the old one, the one Constance put the document in, I gave it to Mr. Sedley as she asked. But before I did, I looked at the document. She said this without excuse or ornament. I know she asked me not to. I looked because she died suddenly the next day and I was frightened of not knowing what I'd handed over." She sat down. The document was a codicil to her will. It instructed that the personal collection, the manuscripts, the journal, all of it, was to be held in trust jointly for both branches of the family. Gerald and Marian in equal proportion. It also contained a paragraph that named the 1891 acquisition and described the original division of assets as having been achieved through what she called deliberate misrepresentation. Her father's, she wrote. She used that phrase quite deliberately. She said she was sorry it had taken this long. Miss Marple was quiet, then she said, "And Gerald would have lost in real terms, not sentiment, but money." "The manuscripts alone," said Polly, "have been recently valued. I saw the valuation when it was done 2 years ago. They are worth considerably more than Gerald's entire property portfolio, as far as anyone can estimate from his company accounts." She paused. "He went upstairs on Wednesday morning. She told him what she intended to do. He left. He knew what was in the collection, and he knew what it would mean if the codicil stood." "And the journal," said Miss Marple, "documented not only the 1891 acquisition, but the specific mechanism of the family division, the evidence in writing from Arthur Wren himself." If the journal is gone, said Polly, it becomes much harder to support the claim of deliberate misrepresentation. It becomes easier to argue that Constance was elderly and confused, that the codicil was made under, what's the phrase? Undue influence, said Miss Marple, or lack of testamentary capacity. Which Gerald will argue, said Polly. But the journal is not the only evidence, said Miss Marple. She thought of the photographs on Polly's phone. And there is also the question of how Constance died. She said this with the same quiet register as everything else, which is the only way to say things that matter. Have you spoken to Dr. Farwell recently? Polly looked at her. Not since the death certificate. I think, said Miss Marple, that it might be worth someone speaking to him again. I think he has something he wants to say and has been waiting for a proper reason to say it. She thought of a woman in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Tanner who had been the village nurse for many years, and who had once said to her, over a difficult cup of hospital tea, that the hardest professional thing she had ever done was watch and wait for someone else to ask the question she already knew the answer to. Miss Marple had understood then. She understood it completely now. Chapter 9. A conversation with Mr. Sedley. Mr. Sedley agreed to see Miss Marple on Tuesday afternoon. He did not ask when she telephoned why she wished to see him. He simply named a time, which Miss Marple found interesting because it meant he had been expecting a call of this kind from some direction. His office was in a Victorian building off the Market Square, the proper sort of solicitor's office with bookshelves that had the authority of actually read legal references, good carpets that had not been replaced since they stopped needing replacing, and windows that looked out on a courtyard where a single ash tree was managing its autumn without drama. He was already standing when she was shown in, which is either good manners or the stance of someone who does not wish to seem unprepared, and in his case was probably both. Miss Marple, he said, please sit down. She sat. He remained standing for a moment longer, then sat as well. Between them was a desk with a folder on it that he didn't open but didn't move away from. I imagine, he said, that you have spoken to Polly Ashford. And to Dr. Farwell, said Miss Marple. And to Marian Holt, and to Gerald Wren, briefly, in a professional context. Mr. Sedley's expression was the expression of a man processing information he has anticipated, and is weighing against what he already knows. May I ask, he said, in what capacity you're pursuing these conversations? In no formal capacity whatsoever, said Miss Marple. I am a retired, I was never anything in the official sense. I am an old woman who was in a bookshop at a useful moment and found herself unable to stop paying attention. She folded her hands in her lap. I am not asking you to breach any professional confidence, Mr. Sedley. I would not do that. I simply wish to tell you one or two things that may or may not affect what you feel it is your duty to do. He waited. Dr. Farwell is, I believe, in the process of reconsidering his death certificate, said Miss Marple. He has noted certain physical details that he attributed initially to natural causes, and is now less certain about. If he proceeds, and I think he will, there will be an investigation. The codicil Constance placed in the green ledger will be material evidence. The photographs Polly Ashford made of the family journal pages will be material evidence, and the fact that the journal itself has been removed from the collection will be relevant. You are describing, said Mr. Sedley very carefully, a situation in which Constance Wren was killed. I am describing a situation, said Miss Marple, in which a woman made arrangements suggesting she feared she was in danger, and died the following day by causes her own doctor is no longer certain were entirely natural, and in which evidence relevant to her estate has subsequently gone missing. The codicil is safe, said Mr. Sedley. He opened the folder. I have it here. I have held it here since Polly brought it to me. Gerald Wren has not seen it. He has requested to see it. I've told him I will schedule a full reading of the will and related documents at the appropriate time. He paused. I will also tell you, Miss Marple, that Constance Wren telephoned me on the Wednesday morning before her death. Before she wrote the codicil, in fact. She told me she believed her nephew intended to prevent her from making changes to her estate arrangements, and she asked me specifically what protections existed if a testator was physically harmed before they could execute a new document. A pause. I told her she should call the police. She said she wasn't certain enough yet. She said she needed to speak to Gerald first, to understand what he actually intended. And then she spoke to him, said Miss Marple, and then she wrote the codicil, and then she died. The room was very quiet, with the quality of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid. "I have already been in contact with the police," said Mr. Sedley, "informally, since this morning. Your visit, if you will forgive me saying so, is timely rather than informative. I had already reached most of these conclusions." He looked at her. "Though I was not certain about the journal photographs." "Polly Ashford has them," said Miss Marple, "where they document everything." He nodded. He picked up the telephone on his desk. Then he set it down again and looked at Miss Marple. "She was a remarkable woman," he said. "I had known her for 40 years. "I only knew her through her annotations," said Miss Marple, "but I formed the same impression." Chapter 10. What the photographs proved. The police inspector was named Bracewell, a careful woman in her 40s with short, practical hair, and the manner of someone who had learned to separate facts from feelings, not because feelings were irrelevant, but because sorting them later was cleaner. She came to the Bell Inn on Wednesday morning and sat with Miss Marple in the front parlour over tea, and asked questions that were direct and precise, and showed that Mr. Sedley had indeed been thorough in his briefing. "The photographs of the journal," she said. "You've seen them?" "I have," said Miss Marple. "The entries in question are from 1891 and cover several pages in detail. They document a private acquisition and the subsequent disposition of assets in terms that are, shall we say, frank about the ethical considerations involved. The founding Wren was a man of some conscience, and he wrote things down with that conscience rather than for effect. And the later annotations, Constance Wren's additions in the margins." "She annotated the journal the way she annotated everything she read," said Miss Marple. "Not extensively, but precisely. The entry about the 1891 acquisition has 2 marginal notes. One reads, 'This was not shown to Edna.' The other reads, 'She was paid less because she was not told what it was worth.' Inspector Bracewell wrote something in her notebook. The manuscripts in the locked cabinet have been examined. The provenance documentation is consistent with Constance Wren's account and the photographs support their value." "Which makes the codicil straightforward," said Miss Marple. "If it stands." "If it stands," said Bracewell, "Mr. Sedley is confident it will. The question of Constance Wren's death is rather more complex. Dr. Farwell has requested a second examination." "Has Gerald Wren been?" "We've had an initial conversation with Mr. Wren," said Bracewell. "He is aware that questions have arisen. His solicitor has been contacted." She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was neither congratulatory nor suspicious, simply precise. "You've been very useful, Miss Marple, very carefully useful, if I may say so." Miss Marple accepted this with a small nod. "I have done nothing except talk to people who wish to talk," she said. "It is amazing what people say when they are given a suitable listener. I have been told so most of my life, and I still find it rather remarkable." "Gerald Wren," said Bracewell, "visited the shop on Wednesday morning. He has acknowledged this. He says they discussed estate planning generally. He denies any specific discussion of the codicil. He claims he didn't know about the codicil until after her death." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "But Constance telephoned Mr. Sedley that morning and told him Gerald intended to prevent her from making changes to her estate arrangements. She used the word prevent. That is a strong word for a woman who chose her words carefully." "We know about the phone call," said Bracewell. "Mr. Sedley provided us with his notes." She closed her notebook. "There is the matter of the teacup. Gerald's fingerprints are in the shop. He was there. He would have handled things. But there was a second teacup. Polly says she washed only her own cup on Wednesday and left Constance's on the counter. The cup found in the drying rack is not one Polly recognises. Different pattern." "He brought his own cup," said Miss Marple, "or he replaced it. Either way, someone made sure the original cup was not available for examination." "Which is the careful act of someone who planned what they were doing," said Bracewell. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The planning is rather the saddest part of it. It is one thing to do something terrible in a moment of feeling. It is another to do it carefully and in advance, and to return later to wash away the traces. That requires a sustained commitment to the wrongness of it." She did not say more. She looked out the window at the street in the damp autumn light, and the specific sadness of it settled around her in the way that these things do when you have lived long enough to understand them. Chapter 11. What Gerald Wren had decided, the arrest was made on Thursday afternoon. Miss Marple was not present for it. She was at the bookshop sitting in the William Morris chair, when Polly took the call from Inspector Bracewell and stood for a long time after she ended it without moving. "The second examination," said Polly finally. "They found traces of a compound, a plant-derived compound," the inspector said. "The sort that acts slowly and mimics pre-existing conditions." She set the phone down on the desk with care. He put it in her tea on Wednesday morning. That's why she said what she said to me about trusting people who needed something from her. She didn't know, not exactly, but she suspected something. She had time to act on the suspicion, said Miss Marple, and she did act. She wrote the document. She gave Marian the book. She telephoned Mr. Sedley. She folded her hands. She did everything she could. It wasn't enough to save her. No, said Miss Marple. It was enough to ensure that what she intended happened anyway, which is not the same thing, but it is something. Polly stood behind the desk for a while, not doing anything with her hands. He was going to challenge the will, she said, even with the codicil. He was planning to argue she lacked capacity. He'd spoken to Gerald's solicitor, the inspector mentioned this, about the possibility of a challenge even before she died. He thought, if she died with the existing will in place and no codicil, he would simply inherit everything. He would have had the manuscripts, the building, all of it. But she had already given the codicil to Mr. Sedley, said Miss Marple, which Gerald either did not know or underestimated. He didn't know about Polly's photographs of the journal either, said Polly. He took the journal thinking that without it, the codicil's claim of misrepresentation would be harder to prove. She looked at the shelf. But Constance photographed everything, because she was careful, because she had been thinking about this for a long time. The annotation on the 1891 entry, said Miss Marple. This is why. She'd known for a long time that this account required settling. She was merely trying to find the right way to do it. And Gerald knew she was moving toward it, said Polly. When she told him on Wednesday what she planned to do, he decided he couldn't let it happen. Miss Marple looked at the row of annotated books, 12 of them, the reading life of a woman who had argued with everything she loved. She thought about the kind of grief that belongs not to sudden shocking loss, but to the slow understanding that someone chose, deliberately, to end a life that had decades left in it. She did not say this to Polly, who was already carrying it. She simply sat with her until the shop closed. Chapter 12. What the codicil said in full, the formal reading of the will took place in Mr. Sedley's office on the following Monday. Gerald Wren was represented only by his solicitor now, which was its own kind of statement, and Miss Marple was not present for it. But Polly came to the Bell Inn that evening and told her what had been decided, and Miss Marple listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that were not quite over even when they appeared to be. The shop went to Polly Ashford outright by specific bequest, with the provision that she operate it as a bookshop for a minimum of 10 years. The codicil established the joint trust for the manuscripts and the personal collection, divided equally between Marian Holt and the estate of Gerald Wren, which under the circumstances was something of an irony. The building's value was assessed and an equivalent sum set aside for Marian from other estate assets, which made it financially equitable in the way that Constance had apparently been calculating for some time. She did the maths years ago, said Polly, sitting in the Bell Inn's parlour with a glass of cider she was not drinking. Mr. Sedley said so. The final numbers in the codicil matched calculations she'd done in a letter she'd written to herself in 2019 and kept in his files. She'd been working out how to make it fair for 20 years. And only moved when Gerald forced her hand, said Miss Marple. He came on Wednesday to tell her not to change anything. He'd found out somehow, through the solicitor perhaps, or through something she'd let slip, that she was planning to act. He told her, apparently, that any changes to the will would be challenged and that she should reconsider. Polly turned her glass. She didn't reconsider. No, said Miss Marple. She was not a woman who reconsidered once she had decided. One can tell that from the margins. Marian Holt, Polly said, had been told about the trust and had cried in Mr. Sedley's office, not with relief exactly, but with the release of a person who has been carrying something for so long they have forgotten what not carrying it feels like. She had said apparently that she wished it had happened differently, that she wished Constance had simply called her and told her years ago, rather than trying to fix it formally. That 20 years of distance might have been 20 years of knowing each other. People often know the right thing and wait for a better moment, said Miss Marple. The better moment does not always arrive. That is one of the sadder true things about how people live. She set her own glass down. Marian has the annotated book. She will find, I think, that it is a kind of companionship. Constance arguing in the margins. It is quite alive, that voice. Polly was quiet for a moment. What will you do now? She asked. Will you stay? A little longer, said Miss Marple. It is a very good bookshop, and autumn in this part of the country has always seemed to me to be worth the sitting still for. Chapter 13, The Remaining Seasons. November came into Stonebridge-on-Avon through the market square and down the narrow streets without particular hurry, the light going low and the ash tree in Mr. Sedley's courtyard losing its remaining leaves in small unhurried batches. Miss Marple walked past Wren and Parchment each morning, and each morning Polly's light was on at the right time, which was the 7 time, which was the normal time, which meant that things were settling into their proper shape. She called on Marian Holt one last time before she left. Marian was sitting in her front room with the annotated book open on her lap. Not reading it exactly, but engaged in the kind of sustained proximity to something that amounts to a conversation. She offered tea and Miss Marple accepted, and they sat together in the particular comfort of people who have been through something and do not need to explain it to each other. "I've been in touch with a specialist," Marian said, "for the manuscripts, once the trust is formally established. We're going to have them properly catalogued and exhibited eventually. I thought, a small exhibition at the shop. Constance would have liked that." She paused. "I think she would have liked it." "I think so too," said Miss Marple. "I've been reading her annotations," said Marian. "In the book. In this one and in the others, Polly has let me look through." She smoothed the open page. "She argues with everything. Not angrily. More like she simply cannot let a statement go unchallenged. She asks questions in the margins constantly. Is this actually true? Whose version is this? Who was not present for this account?" She stopped. "She should have asked those questions of me years ago. I would have answered them." "She perhaps wasn't ready," said Miss Marple, "and until she was." "No," said Marian, "and neither was I." She closed the book. "Gerald was a greedy man who did a terrible thing for money. I understand that. But I also know that what he was trying to protect was something that had been built over 100 years, and that the building of it had not been clean. My grandmother was wronged. Constance's father was wrong. And Gerald thought that meant he could do another wrong on top of it, which is how these things travel through families, I suppose." "Down through the generations," said Miss Marple. "Each one inheriting the wrong and finding a new way to perpetuate it, until someone stops." She smiled gently. Constance stopped. Marian looked at her. "At the cost of everything." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is sometimes what it costs." She left Marian's house at 4 in the afternoon when the light was already going amber and low over the rooftops. She walked back along the hill road, past the church, past the market square, past the Bell Inn, and stopped outside Wren and Parchment, which was still open. The light inside was warm and particular. Through the window she could see Polly at her desk, working. On the shelf directly visible through the glass, the annotated books sat in their row, 12 of them, the record of a mind that had never stopped arguing, never stopped noticing, never stopped finding things worth the effort of engagement. The door would require a particular sideways pressure just below the handle. Miss Marple knew this now. She pushed it open anyway. Inside, the smell of books that had been read in, lived beside, carried on journeys. The small lamp was on. The William Morris chair was empty and waiting. She sat down.